Hello and welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick, your resident disaster enthusiast.
And I'm Arin Babbick, the guy who keeps getting dragged into this muck. Sometimes literally, as you'll see today.
Today, we're flushing out the details of one of the most bizarre and crappy disasters in medieval history, the Erfurt Latrine Collapse of 1184.
It's a story of how a floor full of nobles went from lording over the land to being lorded over by, well, sewage.
Talk about a royal flush!
Or as I like to call it, the original Game of Thrones. Except the only throne involved was one you really didn't want to sit on.
So, grab a seat, preferably a sturdy one, and let's plunge into this mess together.
Because when it comes to medieval politics, it's not about who's on top. It's about who sinks to the bottom.
All right, guys, welcome back and welcome to 2025.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, because this is going to air after the new year.
Yeah.
Pretty exciting. I have been wanting to do this one pretty much from the moment we talked about doing this podcast because it's just so hilarious. The Erfurt disaster of 1184. It proves we've been laughing at rich people having bad things happen to them for at least 1,000 years. That's really what it comes down to. And no matter...
Time-honored pastime.
And it feels topical, which is why I chose it for this week. Because no matter how you feel about, current events and what's going on, the reality is that impulse to kind of darkly laugh at terrible things happening, it's as old as time.
Oh, it goes back a ways.
We've been doing it over and over. And I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong. I'm just going to say it's reality. This is something that a lot of people do. And it's okay if you don't, and it's okay if you do, as long as you're not, going out and harming people.
Truth.
These kinds of disasters, I feel like, really show that no one is immune to catastrophe, no matter how much money you have, no matter how much power you have. Sometimes bad things just happen, and sometimes bad things come to people who deserve it. Not often enough, not always, and not to say that the people in this story deserved it. This disaster also is just absolutely hilarious. It is the slapstick story of history. There's no other way to describe it.
I'm ready.
You ready?
Oh, yeah, but first... What are we drinking in honor of this particular catastrophe?
Oh my God. Arin was so excited when I told him the drink I picked. It's, wait for it, toilet water.
What a name.
There's a couple of different recipes for toilet water cocktails online because apparently this is like a thing. It's so much of a thing. There's multiple recipes. The one we chose, the one I chose with Erin's great joy, was blue curacao vodka and Sprite. So it's actually pretty tasty.
It is pretty tasty.
And it does look like
Tastes
toilet
better
water.
than it sounds.
It does look like toilet water, though.
Yeah, the blue bowl.
I mean, that's kind of the point of this drink, is it looks like toilet water. So we're drinking toilet water, much like all of the nobles in Erfurt did in 1184. So let's dive in. Erfurt is... Let's dump in. So this disaster took place in medieval Europe in a town called Erfurt, obviously, which is now in modern-day Germany. The town still stands. A lot of the buildings involved in this story still stand, which is kind of cool.
Okay.
But in the 12th century, in 1184, it was in the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire is not the same thing as the ancient Roman Empire, and it's not the same thing as the Eastern Roman Empire. This is basically Europe's Roman Empire that was founded by Charlemagne.
Okay.
Which is its own fascinating history. But at this time, the empire was not one political body. They weren't all together under the emperor. The emperor was ostensibly in charge, but the reality was it was just a collection of like city-states or small nations or even small, villages that were very feudal in nature. And when really big things came up, the emperor would decide, but a lot of the power was resting in these feudal lords and sometimes kings, depending on what area of the Roman Empire you were in.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
A lot of political strife and a lot of just stuff going on all around and not really under one banner, despite, being under one banner.
Okay.
Random fact that I found out while I was doing the research, the Holy Roman Empire lasted from 800 to 1806.
Ooh.
I didn't realize it
run.
lasted as long as 1806 because, most of the stuff I've learned about the Roman Empire is the ancient Roman Empire, and then it's split into West and East and all that kind of stuff. But the Holy Roman Empire lasted until basically Napoleon, and the reason the empire disbanded was because Napoleon was winning everything. So the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Francis II of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, abdicated his title, essentially just to prevent Napoleon from being able to become the Holy Roman Emperor.
Oh, weird.
Isn't that kind of bananas?
If I can't have it, no one can.
I mean, there's more to it than that, but a lot of it came down to that, and that never was something I learned in history class.
Yeah,
of all the things that Napoleon did, he also put the final knife in the Roman Empire. So, cool. Work with that. In the 12th century, though, it was during the, I'm going to butcher this name, but I'm going to try really hard, Hohenstaufen dynasty, which was also known as the Stauffer dynasty. And this dynasty lasted from approximately 1138 to 1254. This is not crazy important to the story, but there were a lot of little dynasties throughout the course of this. And this ties into the fact that, nothing was really well put together. There was a lot of territorial disputes. There was a lot of arguments over whether clergy should be more in charge or noblemen should be more in charge. They were all together, but not really, even as early as the 12th century. Now, Erfurt is a German city that's existed since the 8th century. So even by the time this story happened, it had been around for a couple of hundred years. It's the capital and the largest city in the German state of Thuringia.
Okay.
And even today, Erfurt's Old Town is one of the best preserved medieval cities in all of Germany, which is pretty cool. Something I'd love to visit at some point.
That sounds rad.
On a random historical anecdote, Martin Luther is the one who started Protestantism, went to college in Erfurt.
Oh, really?
And he was actually ordained in the church that this story talks about.
That's pretty cool.
Isn't that neat? He spent a lot of time there, which is pretty interesting. Erfurt was in an incredibly strategic location in central Germany. So at this point, it was a pretty important town. It was generally a great meeting place for nobles and clergy to get together and figure out things that were going on in Germany at the time. It grew very quickly. Its infrastructure, however, did not really keep up with the growth by the time we got to the 12th century. It was getting bigger because of its strategic location. It was getting more and more nobles coming in, but they weren't updating the buildings as much as they probably should have with the influx of people.
Right, because someone would have to pay for that.
Yep. On that note, we're going to kind of sidetrack here because this is a disaster called the latrine disaster. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the history of toilets because I think it's important. The oldest known example of a sewage system is actually from 2500 BC in Pakistan.
Really?
Yeah. The town of Mohenjo-Daro had brick toilets over a sewage system that took waste away to a cesspit outside of the city.
Huh. Okay.
However, in the next, archaeological evidence we have of that is in the 9th century in the Roman Empire. They started developing their own public toilets and sewage system and stuff like that. However, by the 12th century, in Europe, most people were still using chamber pots with the exception of richer areas or large towns would sometimes have public toilets. Toilets in medieval times were pretty diverse. So in the 12th century, there was a lot of different ways that they could go about these things.
Yeah, no standardization yet.
Nothing at all. They could range from just digging a hole, pooping in it outside and going back to work, to complex systems that involved cesspits kind of draining into moats or rivers from inside of castles.
Lovely.
In urban areas, there was a lot of communal latrines that served multiple households and public spaces. So they would just have big public toilets where you would go and you would chat about the day while pooping next to somebody. It would go into a pit, and then that pit would either need to be cleaned out by what's called gong farmers every so often.
That's a shitty job.
It's a really shitty job. And they were only allowed to do it at night so they wouldn't disturb other people. Or these cesspits sometimes connected to, like I said, moats, rivers, other bodies of water. How
disturbed can you be if you're having a conversation pooping next to someone?
I don't know, man, but apparently they got paid really well because not a lot of people wanted to do the job. Gong farmer was a good job, or a well-paid one anyway.
Yeah. I don't know about good job, but...
Castles, manors, church buildings, all these kinds of more hoity-toity places tended to have better sewage systems. They often featured something called guard robes.
Guard ropes?
Guard robes. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Garderobes.
Okay.
And what those were is essentially a building piece would stick out, and there'd be a bench over it, and the bench would have a hole in it, and the hole would go straight down, and there would be a hole underneath that room. So they just pooped outside of the castle. So you sat down, and there was a chute that went straight down the castle wall, and they just poop out the castle. And then the gong farmers would come by and scoop it into the moat.
So did you just everyone knew not to walk on that side of the castle?
I guess, but there was actually in 1203.
Is this where the saying that you'll get shit on from a great height comes from?
That could be. I wouldn't say The chutes were often lined with brick and stones to kind of prevent erosion, but that also left little handholds. So at one point in 1203, King Richard I's French palace fell to invaders because they climbed up the guardrobe chutes. They invaded by climbing in through the shit tunnels.
I don't think I would choose that way to go in.
It worked.
Though.
At that point, they started, this is after the disaster, but they started putting bars on the guard ropes so that invaders couldn't climb into the castles, which is pretty interesting. For the ones that weren't guard ropes, though, they would have big latrines and, privy chambers in these castles as well, or even the private ones would all go down one chute into what's called a cesspit.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you might have 5 privy chambers in private bedrooms, and they would all have their own chute, and that chute would go directly into the cesspit, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a giant hole dug out in the ground, and everyone's toilets would have little tubes that go through the walls down into the cesspit, which is the bottom of the castle, dug out underneath things.
Right down the poop chute.
Right. These were typically made out of stone, again, with little holes in it so that the poop and the pee and all the other, human excrement could kind of leach out into the soil, and then a blank bottom. But even with that, for the ones that didn't connect to waterways, they still had to be cleaned out by gong farmers. And these cesspits were just awful. They were deep, they were murky, they were filled with quicksand-like filth. They harbored bacteria that often caused a lot of horrible things. They harbored parasites. It just wasn't a great place to work in. It wasn't a great place to deal with.
Yeah, it's like going into a septic tank.
Exactly right. Now, the more advanced ones, like I said, the cesspit would start underneath whatever building it was, and then it would extend out to the point where it could kind of run off into whatever body of water was nearby. Those were considered advanced.
Just drink from upstream.
Apparently. But the ones that were like that so that they didn't have to be cleaned. Or at least that was the theory.
Right.
So no one would go in and clean them, and they would build up for decades and decades. Because no one cleaned it. On my quest to learn more about medieval toilets, I also ended up digging into toilet paper, because I was sitting there going, how did that happen back in the day? And I'm here to tell you that toilet paper, as we know it today, was invented in 1857 by Joseph Gatti. Shortly afterwards, the flush toilet became standardized. However, in Roman times, ancient Rome, and in a lot of Europe, the nobility and more well-off people would use essentially a sponge on a stick to wipe themselves off, and then they would put it into a bowl of vinegar to decontaminate before the next person used it. Many people used sticks, moss, leaves, and monasteries. A lot of them actually had evidence of them using cut-off cloth from their clothing. It also apparently wasn't uncommon to use documents that you didn't really like. In China, people were using paper centuries before the rest of the world was. But again, it was literally paper. There was a number of anecdotes from ancient Chinese people talking about how they didn't have a good document to use for toilet paper because all the ones they had were important, and they needed to wait until they had something unimportant to be able to use, which was fascinating. And then they ended up developing this rice paper toilet paper in, I think it was the 9th century. So they were the first official makers and users of toilet paper. You're welcome.
Okay. Well, I didn't know any of that. That's fascinating. I did know how it worked on old sailing ships.
How did it work on old sailing ships?
Well, that's why we call it the head, because it was at the head of the ship. You would climb out over the bow, and there would be a plank with a hole cut in it.
You just pooped off the side?
Yep, right off the front. And then there would be what's called a swab, which is a rope that's been flayed out. It's tied off, and then all the rest of the rope dangling to the end is unspun.
So you swab your butt like you swab the deck?
Yep. And you'd use that to clean yourself up and then drop it into the water.
No, you just threw it away.
No. It's hanging onto the ship. So it would get cleaned for the next person.
That would really suck if you had hemorrhoids and you're just rubbing salt water all over
Ooh.
it. Sorry, that's my first thought there. It's a bad day. That's a bad day in general. I'm glad I'm not a sailor. Now, at this time, most monasteries and religious places, like cathedrals and whatnot, had really advanced from medieval times, waste disposal systems and sewers. And I would imagine more advanced toilet paper things. Because like I said before, apparently they were using cloth before
Sponge on
most
a
of the rest of the
stick.
world.
Yeah.
I don't even know. But it was part of, the Catholic religion at the time to be pretty clean. So it makes sense that the monasteries had pretty good systems comparatively to a lot of the rest of Europe.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's talk about some of the cast of characters in this story.
Please, I need to know them.
Henry VI. This man is the King of Germany. He is the second son of Frederick Barbarossa, who is the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at this point, and he is in line to become the next Holy Roman Emperor. He's 19 years old when this story takes place, and his father, he had a lot to live up to. One of the biggest things that Frederick Barbarossa did is he actually reinstituted the Roman rule of law centuries after ancient Rome, but it was the first time in a very long time that a lot of Europe actually had a rule of law, and he managed to actually uphold it. It wasn't just on paper only. People were following it and doing what they should be doing, which is pretty awesome. We also have Landgrave Ludwig III of Thuringia, who was a cousin of Henry VI, and Archbishop Conrad I of Mainz. Now, Ludwig was no stranger to controversy. At this time, there was still quite a bit of roiling and boiling over what was called the investiture controversy. And that essentially was just a lot of arguments over whether or not the clergy should be running things or noblemen should be running things. And Ludwig got his hands dirty in a lot of that, and he pissed off a number of people in different ways. While the investiture conflict, was officially resolved, there was still a ton of tension between feudal lords and religious leaders like Archbishop Conrad. For whatever reason, Ludwig III and Archbishop Conrad were in a big dispute. They were pissed at each other. They were arguing over something. Odds are it was land. We don't know for sure, but we do know that in 1180, Archbishop Conrad I began constructing a fortified castle called Castle Heilenberg on a strategic hill near Kassel, which was right up against Ludwig III's territory. So there's a pretty good chance that Ludwig III was like, why the fuck are you building a castle there? That's right next to my land. Like, what's going on here? And odds are that Archbishop Conrad was building it there to protect himself from Ludwig, who I don't have it, on extremely excellent authority, but everything I read, this man pissed off a lot of people. So not surprising that the Archbishop would like to distance himself a little bit. It was, regardless, though, a pretty aggressive move, and things escalated further and further until finally King Henry VI was like, you know what, we really need to do something about it. We need to settle this dispute. We need to get these guys to stop fighting because this is not great. Henry VI decided to call what's called a diet. Now, a diet is not like a hunger strike to make Ludwig and Conrad get along. A diet is a Roman word for basically a gathering of nobles to kind of figure things out. It's not a legislative body. Its whole purpose was to talk about things and negotiate. So call in a bunch of nobles from the surrounding area. Let's talk about the problem. Let's figure out what it is, and let's solve it so y'all aren't arguing anymore. So he called it. The diet was going to happen on July 26th, 1184. By July 25th, a bunch of noblemen from the area were arriving into Erfurt for this diet. They were coming from all over, including Saxony. There was all kinds of just really famous at the time noblemen that were there. I'm going to try and say these names. Please forgive me if I fail entirely. There was Goslar III, Count Frederick of Kirchberg, and Count Heinrich I of Schwarzburg. Now I want to talk about Heinrich I because he was one of the people who had an issue with Ludwig III. He was almost certainly responsible for the theft of a really popular manuscript that Ludwig III had. And apparently at this time, it was pretty common for noblemen to just kind of steal manuscripts from each other as almost like hazing or a way to piss them off would not actually start a war, because manuscripts, they were very hard to make at this time. They were
Right.
very expensive. They were all handwritten. And I don't want to say it was common, but it wasn't uncommon for noblemen to steal other noblemen's manuscripts just to be an asshole, I guess.
Okay.
And on Ludwig III's wedding night, this particular manuscript was stolen.
On his wedding night.
On
Got it.
his
Okay.
wedding night. And then after Heinrich I died, his brother gave the manuscript back to Ludwig III. So it's almost certain that he stole it. We're not totally sure what their feud was about, but like it was pretty well established they didn't like each other, and it's almost certain that he stole Ludwig's poor manuscript.
Okay.
So, yeah, there we are. On another note, Heinrich I had a well-known saying throughout the course of his life.
Okay.
He used to say, "If I fail, so may I die in excrement." Unfortunately, one of the things he's very remembered for at this point.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry, Henry.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. So, the diet was going to take place in the Church of St. Peter in Erfurt in the Petersburg Citadel, which was like a big fortified area, and then it was going to take place in the actual church itself. This church is still standing, though it's not the same. I guess it's not still standing. There's a church on the location that this church was standing. It's been built and rebuilt several times.
Okay.
But this church, the way it was, eventually was the church where Martin Luther was ordained.
Oh, cool.
Which is pretty interesting. This was also the church where Henry the Lion had submitted to Barbarossa, which, if you know, I'm not going to get into too much history of Henry the Lion because I'm already going on so many tangents. But he was a pretty powerful dude in the 12th century. He's actually the founder of Munich. And he had a lot of issues with Frederick Barbarossa and Henry VI. And he ultimately
Sounds like
submitted
they're
to
all
them.
great friends.
I mean, again, I told you this is a feudal system. Everyone's kind of warring together. And the Church of St. Peter had an especially large latrine because it has a number of monks living there and different people coming in and out of the area. So
Okay.
it was bigger than most and right under the middle of the cathedral and sticking out a bit over and then running into the river. So
Okay.
it was huge. It hadn't been cleaned in probably 60 years from what I read.
That's a long time.
And was clogged
That's
up
a
with
lot of shit.
60 years worth of human excrement. So, picture that. So we have a group of at least 100 noblemen that have arrived. A lot of them are going to be in chainmail because this is medieval. Most of them got there on the 25th, but they all got together on the 26th on the second story of St. Peter's Church to talk about the issue that was going on between Ludwig and Conrad. The room they were gathered in, 2 stories up, was directly above the latrine under St. Peter's Church.
Okay.
The infrastructure of this town hadn't really kept up. A lot of the floors were not doing well. A lot of the supports were not doing well. And when you bring in that many noblemen, many of which are probably in chainmail, the floor wasn't designed to hold that much.
And they're probably also a little bit thicker around the middle.
It ended up collapsing almost immediately upon the start of
Immediately.
the diet. Almost immediately, sending 60 to 100 noblemen lunging into the depths of this latrine.
So they crashed through 2 floors.
2 floors into the latrine. So some of them died from being literally crushed. Because these are not, it's not like our floors in our house. Our house was built in 1980. And our house is nice. I like our house. But our floors are not made out of thick timbers the way.
Or stone.
Or stone, the way a medieval church would have been
Right.
made. So people were crushed. There were a number of people who literally drowned in the excrement that were under there. There were people who died from being suffocated by the fumes. At least 60 of the noblemen. Oh, it's horrible. At least 60 of them died, but there are many reports of up to 100. So somewhere between 60 to 100 of the richest, most powerful people in Germany just dead. Moment's notice.
Nice sound effect
You're welcome.
for this one.
You're welcome.
Can I say that's a crappy way to go?
There were a number of them who died later due to diseases, and while they are not officially counted in the death count, we can all kind of assume they probably had something to do with it.
Yeah.
Of the people who died, our 3 main characters all survived.
Really?
King Henry and Conrad had excused themselves to this little stone alcove by the window, right as it started to kind of briefly talk to each other. When the floor fell out from under them, they both managed to grab hold of the bars on the window and hold on for dear life until people came in and rescued them.
Oh, man.
Ludwig III fell into the shit pit and was pulled out alive.
Good Lord.
Unfortunately, our friend Heinrich I did end up dying in excrement. He perished.
Clearly, he failed, so...
He met his end as he said he would, drowning in shit. It was a bad day for Henrik. Ultimately, Ludwig III, while he survived that disaster, he ended up dying in 1190 on a ship returning from the Crusades of some kind of disease. We don't know for sure exactly what it was, but I think there's a pretty solid chance that ending up in a literal cesspit didn't extend his life for long.
No, his health probably suffered a little.
His health probably suffered a little bit. So that's the main disaster part. There's no historical record on whether or not their differences were ever resolved, because the two people who this disaster happened because of, Heinrich, Ludwig, and Conrad, we don't know whether or not they ever figured out their shit. There's no historical record on it. Henry VI left town immediately after he was rescued from hanging onto the bars. It was done. It was like, I'm out of here. We're done with this. Henry's survival, though, is probably like the most consequential part of this disaster, because he did go on to become the Holy Roman Emperor. He became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, so only 7 years after this.
Well, everyone else died.
Well, no, his dad was alive, and the Holy Roman Empire was huge. He was next in line, though, to be the Holy Roman Emperor. So if he had died in the shit pit, it would have pretty drastically changed some of history. He was not quite as successful as his father. He had a big legacy to live up to, but he did end up capturing Richard the Lionheart.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when he was the emperor. And he got Richard the Lionheart to kind of bring peace to France and keep England from fucking around with the Holy Roman Empire much more. And also just capturing Richard the Lionheart sounds really cool on your resume.
Right?
Pretty awesome. He ended up dying in 1197, falling seriously ill with chills and fever. Again, maybe it had nothing to do with the disaster. Could have easily been malaria, given the areas that he was traveling to.
Right.
But it's also very possible that being around that much shit shortened his life expectancy, because he died pretty young. He was only 32 when he passed.
Okay.
So pretty young. With that, the Erfurt disaster did also pretty drastically impact local politics for a period of time, because when you kill off most of your nobility, it's going to leave a power vacuum.
Oh, yeah. There's a big void there.
A big void. So there was a lot of shifting of alliances and lands and all those kinds of things. It also kickstarted a big infrastructure improvement in the city of Erfurt.
Because no one else wanted to fall into a pool of shit.
The University of Erfurt was eventually founded in
terror in everyone's eyes.
1392. And that is the university that Martin Luther attended, and it's still Germany's oldest university. It's still there. And that probably wouldn't have happened if they hadn't upped their infrastructure as well as they had. Again, we don't know for sure.
And obviously they rebuilt the church.
They did. Well, they
Martin
fixed
Luther
up the church, and then they tore it down, and then they rebuilt it a couple of different times. So that whole area has been through a lot. This event is one of the earliest recorded instances of a mass casualty event due to infrastructure failure, which is pretty interesting. This sparked thoughts about infrastructure throughout Europe as well. It wasn't just in Erfurt. We don't have, a lot of straight lines from this happened, so that happened.
Right.
But it was the beginning of people really starting to think more about that infrastructure and making it better. And we can attribute a lot of that most likely to the Erfurt disaster.
I'm partially distracted by thinking about, I know paper and print was not a thing, but I'm just imagining the political cartoons that would have been drawn about the event.
Right. Well, I mean, they were drawing penises on the walls of ancient Rome, so I imagine there was some kinds of drawings about this somewhere.
Of course.
This also led to people really starting to think about, what should we do with our poop, and trying to deal with it in better ways.
If you keep it around long enough, it'll kill you.
Right? They started moving cesspits further away from towns. And then eventually, obviously, sanitation got a lot better to the point that, we enjoy much nicer things today than we would if we were living in the 12th century. However, the most famous event that really led to a wholesale overhaul of London's sewer system and most of Europe's sewer system is a disaster that we will cover at some point, but not today.
Okay.
And that disaster is the Great Stink of the summer of 1858.
Oh, I can't wait.
Where the Thames River literally was so overflowing with shit that in the hot weather, people were dying and couldn't breathe because it was so stinky in London. It's a pretty awesome disaster. We will get to that at some point. When the MPs during the Great Stink almost abandoned Westminster, the government decided to act and added 1,100 miles of additional brick-lined sewers to increase the city's capacity to deal with the waste it generated. So the Erfurt disaster did lead to some changes, but it didn't overhaul it to the point that we didn't have things like the Great Stink, which, kind of a bummer. For the most part, outside toilets remained the norm for a very long time, and it was only in the second half of the 20th century that most houses started having toilets inside. Wow. So that's 1950s and on. Kind of bananas when you think about it in those terms. So that's it. It's a very short episode this week. I thought it was topical. I thought it was funny. And I just wanted to tell you about, 100 odd dudes falling in a toilet, having a really bad day.
It's funny. It's bringing up memories, actually.
Bringing up memories.
Oh, so when I was growing up, we had to have our septic tank pumped a couple of times. And one of the guys who came out to pump out our septic tank was telling us about how he'd fallen in to a septic tank when it collapsed the top of it. And so he always checks the integrity of them first or something like that. And he said he had to spend a couple weeks in the hospital.
Oh, I'm sure.
After getting all sorts of shots.
Yeah. When you have a sewage leak in your house, you have to have the whole thing decontaminated.
Yeah,
it's a huge serious issue. Falling into a septic tank is even worse than that. So these people, when I'm half joking about maybe these diseases a couple years after.
Oh, no, I'm sure it killed them.
I'm sure it didn't help. It probably contributed, and to a lot more than just the two we talked about, Ludwig and Henry VI.
Yeah.
It's a terrible thing on so many different levels, but it's also it's so funny.
It is
so funny. And I feel and this is terrible, but it's also just true. It's even more funny because it is all of these pompous elites.
Peacocks and all their finery. I'm sure they're wearing their mail too, which
I'm sure. Yeah.
helped them sink right to the bottom.
Bloop, bloop, bloop. It's slapstick. It's so ridiculous.
I'm picturing, their finery, all their pretty colors just...
Right, and the fact that it happened so quickly kills me too.
And
the king holding on to window bars, with his little legs flailing over the cesspit, and all these people dying beneath him. Help! Help! I need some help.
Wow. And then he just leaves.
He was on his way to a military campaign in Poland, so he was like, fuck it, I'm out. I am not staying around. And part of why we have very few records is the man obviously tried to wipe a lot of the records of this disaster from the time he almost fell in poop.
Yeah.
And all of his buddies.
But that shit stains.
That shit stains. So yeah, that is our full episode for this week. We are so glad you guys came to join us for this short one. Next week will be longer, I promise, because I figured y'all deserved a short one. We released 2 long ones last week. We would love for you to get in contact with us. Let us know how you think we're doing. Let us know if you have any disaster ideas that you'd like us to cover. And you can get a hold of us either through our email, which is catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com, or on our social media. We have X, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, as long as TikTok is still around by the end of January, Blue Sky, and Threads. We also have a website, www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. And on the website, under the pod blog, I post our show notes, which has a brief description of the episode, pictures of things that we are talking about, and a link to all the different sources that I use for whatever disaster it is we're talking about. If you want to support the pod, we have a tip jar that's available on most of the social media and in the show notes. Don't feel obligated, but if you want to financially support us, we would appreciate it. But in general, we really just want to hear from you. Rate, review, email us, get on our social medias. We're excited. We like talking to people. We like knowing what you have to think. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.